In the autumn of 1887, in the hill country of central Colorado, a dead man's possessions were auctioned from the steps of the Garnet Springs courthouse. There was a saddle with a broken tree, a pair of cracked boots, a tin cup, and a square of oilskin, folded 4 times over and tied with a strip of rawhide. The auctioneer held the oilskin up and announced that he did not know what was inside it and did not much care, and the crowd agreed with him. A young woman standing near the back offered $1 for it. No one else raised a hand. Her name was Ora Finch. She was 26 years old, and she had arrived in Garnet Springs 6 days earlier with a surveyor's compass, a leather satchel worn soft at the corners, and very little money. She had trained alongside her father, a cartographer of some precision, who had mapped river basins and canyon approaches across 3 territories before a fever took him in the spring. She carried his instruments and more usefully his particular way of reading the land, the habit of seeing terrain, not as scenery, but as a set of problems solved or waiting to be solved. The crowd watched her tuck the oilskin parcel under her arm and walk away, and a man near the steps said something that made the others laugh. She did not look back. She sat with the parcel that evening at the table of the rooming house where she was staying, the lamp turned up, and untied the rawhide. The oilskin unfolded in 4 neat layers, which told her the man who had wrapped it had done so deliberately, not in haste. Inside was a map. It was not a rough thing scratched in charcoal. It was drawn with ink on heavy paper, in a hand that understood cartographic convention, a hand that had been taught. She recognized the hand of someone trained, not merely someone who had paced out ground and guessed at distances. The hills were rendered in hachure, the draws marked with feathered lines indicating drainage, the elevations suggested through careful cross-contour work. A scale of chains ran along the bottom margin. She set her father's compass beside it and began to compare. The map depicted a section of high country she could place from the surrounding ridge forms. 2 days of hard riding northeast. A canyon system she knew from a secondary survey her father had referenced. And at the center of the map, where the 2 principal drainages met above a limestone scarp, a mark that was neither a topographic symbol nor a camp notation. It was a small cross, inked twice over for emphasis, with a notation beside it in a different hand than the rest of the map, added later in a smaller and less practiced script. The word was cellar. If you have ever held a thing in your hands and felt the weight of what it was trying to tell you, you will understand something of what she felt in that moment. Something had been left in that high canyon. Someone who could draw a map had known where it was. Chester Daw had kept the knowledge wrapped in oilskin and tied with rawhide, though she did not know his name. Then he had meant to go back. She spent the rest of the evening studying the map, making a copy in her own hand on fresh paper, adding the compass bearings she calculated from the scale and the landmarks she could verify, filling in what her father's survey notes confirmed about the canyon geometry. She did not tell anyone where she was going. She paid her rooming house bill through the end of the following week, packed her saddlebags, and left before first light. She did not come back for 7 days. The country northeast of Garnet Springs rose quickly into the high limestone ridges, the scrub oak and cedar giving way to ponderosa pine, and then, above 8,000 feet, to the open parks and granite outcroppings of the true high country. It was cold in the mornings at that elevation, the frost not yet gone by midday, and the trail she followed grew faint by the second afternoon and vanished entirely on the third, replaced by elk sign and the scoured rock of a seasonal drainage. She navigated by the compass and by the map, checking her position against the ridge forms and the canyon mouths, correcting twice when a side canyon she had expected to pass on her left opened instead to the right, evidence of a cartographic error in the original that her father's notes had not anticipated. She recalculated the approach and found the correct drainage by mid-morning of the fourth day. The canyon was deeper than the map suggested. The limestone scarp appeared as a pale band in the far walls streaked with orange iron and pale gray lichen, and at its base the two drainages came together in a gravel flat perhaps 50 yards across. A stand of cottonwood grew at the confluence, the leaves gone to dry paper in the October cold, rattling in the thin wind off the ridge. She tied her horse to one of the cottonwoods and walked the flat with the map in her hand. The cellar notation had been placed above the scarp, not at its base, which she had misread the first time she studied the map. She climbed the scarp along a natural cleft in the limestone, a route that required hands as much as feet, and came out on a narrow shelf of flat ground above. The shelf was perhaps 30 feet wide and backed against a higher cliff face of the same pale stone. It was the kind of place that would be invisible from below and from the canyon floor, a platform hidden by the lip of the scarp itself. There was a door set into the cliff face. It was made of split pine planks, weathered gray, fitted into a frame of squared logs that had been mortared into a cavity in the rock. It was perhaps 5 feet tall and 2.5 feet wide. There was an iron hasp and an iron padlock, both heavily rusted, the lock's shackle seized in the body by years of oxidation. She looked at the door for a long time without touching it. Then she went back down for her tools. Her father had worked in country where old Spanish mining claims were still surfacing, and he had taught her to carry a small punch bar and a short-handled mallet for exactly this kind of encounter with old iron. She had thought the tools excessive when she packed them. She thought differently now as she climbed back up the cleft with the satchel across her back. The padlock was the kind called a railroad pattern, thick-bodied and heavy, made in the 1860 seconds by the look of the casting. The rust had not weakened it so much as fused it. She worked the punch bar into the hasp fitting rather than attacking the lock body directly, feeling for the screws behind the plate, finding them by touch and by the way the wood gave when she leaned on the bar. The screws had rusted in their threads, but the wood around them had dried and contracted over the years, loosening the grip of the fitting. She worked for the better part of an hour. The hasp plate came free in 2 pieces. She opened the door slowly. The hinges held, though they protested, and the door swung inward and to the left, releasing a breath of cold air that smelled of earth and pine resin and something else, something dry and papery that she recognized after a moment as old canvas. She let the outside air move through the opening for a time before she went in. The interior was roughly 8 feet deep and 6 feet wide, cut partly into the rock and partly framed with log walls. The floor was packed earth. A single plank shelf ran along the right wall, and on it, stacked with care, were canvas bags of the kind used to move banknotes, tied at their necks with cord. There were 8 of them. Beside the bags, flat on the shelf, were 2 leather satchels, of the kind a railroad messenger might carry, their clasps latched. Against the left wall stood a small iron strongbox, not locked, its lid slightly ajar. She stood in the doorway and looked at all of it for a long time. She was a cartographer's daughter and not a thief, and she did not touch any of it that afternoon. She went back down to the canyon floor, watered her horse at the drainage, and sat on a flat rock in the thin afternoon sun with the map in her hands, and thought carefully about what she had found and what, if anything, it meant to know. There is a particular kind of thinking that does not resemble what most people call thinking. It is slower than reasoning and quieter than worry. It is closer to the way her father had worked over an incomplete survey, running the known lines forward and back until the gap between them became clear. not through deduction, but through attention. She sat with the knowledge of the seller the way he had sat with an unfinished map, letting it settle into shape. The canvas bags were the size used by the Colorado and Southern Railroad for branch line payroll transfers. Her father had drawn the line approaches through this country in 1882, and she had helped him letter the finished plates. She knew the branch that ran closest to this canyon. On the 5th day, she rode back down to the lower country to a settlement called Redwall that had a telegraph station and a county land office. She sent a wire to the railroad's regional auditor in Denver. She did not say what she had found. She said she had located a survey anomaly in the canyon country northeast of Garnet Springs and required access to the company's transfer records for the Gunnison branch between 1881 and 1884. She said she was a cartographer, working from her father's notes. She gave her name. While she waited for a reply, she went to the land office and asked the clerk, a spare man named Aldous Hicks, to show her the conveyance records for the high country parcels in that section. He was skeptical. He showed her the records anyway, because she asked correctly, and because the records were public. She found what she was looking for in the second ledger. A federal homestead claim had been filed in 1879 in the name of a family called Pruitt for 160 acres of canyon land in the exact section the map depicted. The claim had been abandoned in 1883. The abandonment paperwork cited non-residency. There were 3 surviving Pruitt children, according to a note in the margin in a clerk's hand, resettled at Pueblo. The railroad's wire arrived on the 6th morning. The auditor confirmed that the Gunnison branch payroll had been robbed in July of 1883, 3 express transfers totaling approximately $11,000, and the money had never been recovered. The men responsible had been identified but not apprehended. One had been found dead in New Mexico 3 years later. The company had closed the inquiry for want of any further lead. She wrote a careful reply. She said she believed she knew the location of the missing funds. She gave the canyon coordinates from her map, the corrected ones. She asked that the company send a representative to meet her at the Garnet Springs courthouse, and that the Pruitt family in Pueblo be contacted because the land in which the funds were stored had belonged to them. Then she rode back to Garnet Springs. She arrived on the 7th day in the late afternoon and returned her horse to the livery and her saddlebags to her room. The proprietor of the rooming house, a woman named Mrs. Carr, looked at her as she came in the door, at the dust on her coat and the state of her boots, and said nothing except to ask whether she wanted supper. She said yes. She sat at the table in the rooming house dining room that evening and ate and said very little. And when Mrs. Carr asked her where she had been, she said she had been doing some survey work in the high country. Mrs. Carr looked at her for a moment and then set a piece of pie on the table and went back to the kitchen, which was as close to acknowledgement as the occasion required. The railroad's representative arrived in Garnet Springs 4 days later. His name was Benton, a compact and methodical man from the company's legal department, and he came with a sheriff's deputy from the county seat and a letter of authorization from the Denver office. She met them at the courthouse steps, the same steps where the auctioneer had held up the oilskin parcel and found no buyers but her. She gave Benton the map, both the original and her corrected copy, with her calculations marked in the margins. She told him what she had found and where, and she described the hasp work and the state of the cellar and the contents of the shelf, which she had not disturbed. She told him about the Pruitt family and the abandoned homestead claim. Benton listened without interrupting. When she had finished, he asked her what she wanted. She told him. She wanted the Pruitt heirs located and informed that the land in the canyon section had been used without their knowledge or consent, and that any adjudication of the recovered funds should take account of that use. She wanted her father's survey notes returned to her after the company had finished with them. She wanted the dollar she had spent at the auction reimbursed. Benton looked at her for a moment. "The dollar," he said. "The dollar," she said. The company recovered $11,214 from the cellar on the limestone shelf above the confluence in October of 1887. The railroad returned the funds to the accounts of the branch operations that had been shorted and took no action against anyone living, the man who had drawn the map being dead in New Mexico and the others unlocatable. A portion of the recovered sum was set aside by the railroad's board, after considerable correspondence, for the Pruitt heirs in Pueblo. In recognition of the unauthorized use of their land, it was not a large portion, it was not nothing. Aldous Hicks, the land office clerk, told the story that winter to anyone who would listen. He said a young woman had come in with a cartographer's compass and a look of steady attention, and had found in 2 hours what the company and the county had not found in 4 years. He said she had asked for $1 in reimbursement and received it. He said she had expressed neither triumph nor complaint. She was already gone by the time the story took hold. She had work elsewhere, a River Canyon survey in Arizona Territory that her father had contracted before he died, and that she had taken up in his name with a different instrument and the same compass bearing and the same careful habit of reading the land as a set of problems that patient attention would eventually resolve. The oilskin that had held the map she kept. She rewrapped her father's compass in it for traveling. The 4-layer fold, tied with a length of cord she cut from her satchel. It was better oilskin than the store had, denser and more evenly cured, and it sealed against moisture better than anything she might have bought. The dead man had known his materials, if not his reckoning. She worked the Arizona survey through the winter and into the spring, and the canyon she mapped there was noted in the territory's record as a reference document of unusual precision. The surveyor who received it wrote in the margin that the draftsmanship was of a quality he had not seen in field survey since a cartographer named Finch had worked the river systems a decade prior, and that he was glad to find the standard had been maintained. She did not see the note. She was already a county north, compass in hand, reading what the ridgeline said. If there is a thing that matters in the keeping of a record, whether in ink on heavy paper or in the quiet account a woman makes of her own days, it is the thing she practiced from the beginning. Accuracy. Not the flourish that makes the map pleasing to look at, not the confident assertion that forecloses the question before the ground has been walked. The accuracy that comes from going where the map leads and correcting it when it is wrong, and then going further and writing down what is actually there. Her father had known that. She carried it the way she carried his compass, close and without display, useful because it was true. The map that had sold for $1 hangs today in the archive of the Colorado and Southern Railroad's successor company, catalogued not under the name of the man who drew it or the man who died with it, but under the name of the woman who bought it, Ora Finch, cartographer, as the document that led to the recovery of the Gunnison branch funds. The label was added at the request of the company's archivist in 1901, 14 years after the auction, when the story came up in the course of another inquiry and someone finally thought to ask who she was. The compass is not in any archive. She was still using it. If you know a story of a woman who went looking in country no one else bothered to read, leave the telling of it here. There are more such records than the histories acknowledge, and they deserve their full weight. There is another story waiting just past this one, of a woman who trusted what patient labor can surface in a dismissed and abandoned place. Stay close. The high country northeast of Garnet Springs was not a place that forgave imprecision. The trails that existed below 8,000 feet were made by cattle and elk, and in some seasons, by prospectors chasing the silver color in the creek beds. And they were reliable only as far as the grazing went, which was not far. Above that elevation, the country opened into a kind of bare legibility that her father had always preferred, a landscape where the bones of the terrain showed through and could be read at distance, where the lie of the ridgelines and the direction of the drainages told you something true about where water went and where it came from, and what lay on the other side of the next rise. She had grown up reading that kind of country. She had been 12 years old the first summer. Her father took her into the field, handing her the chain tape and the rod, and showing her how to stand the rod plumb by feel rather than by sight, how to compensate for the wind, how to read the vernier on the transit to the nearest minute of arc. She was 14 the first time he trusted her to letter a finish plate. The careful block capitals of the place names, the flowing curves of the contour lines, the hair-thin drafting of the drainage symbols that indicated intermittent flow. By the time she was 18, she could run a traverse alone and close it to within a chain on a mile of difficult ground. That inheritance was not visible when she walked into a room. It was not the kind of thing that announced itself in the way that a man's profession announced itself, by the tools he carried openly, or the authority with which he spoke. It lived in her hands, and in the way her eyes moved across a landscape, and in the patience that had been built into her by years of work that required getting a thing exactly right or starting over. Chester Daw, whose name she had learned from Benton's inquiry, had not been trained as a cartographer. The survey conventions in the map were borrowed rather than native. The Hattura marks for the hill formed slightly too close together, the scale bar not as carefully derived as it should have been, the contour intervals uneven in the steeper sections. But someone had taught him enough to make the map useful, and the paper and the ink were quality materials, and the oilskin wrapping told her he had understood that the map mattered. He had meant to keep it safe for a long time. She thought about him sometimes as she rode up into that country, not with sympathy exactly, but with the particular attention she gave to any piece of work that had been done with some skill by a person she would never meet. He had drawn a map to something he intended to retrieve. He had not retrieved it. The money had sat in the limestone cellar for 4 years, while the railroad counted its losses, and the Pruitt family stayed in Pueblo, and the auction of his possessions came and went with no one paying attention to the oilskin parcel. $1 was what it had cost her to change all of that. She spent the 5th day in Redwall with more care than she had spent the previous days in the canyon. Sending the wire to the railroad was the necessary first step, but it was not the only piece of work she did in the land office. She asked Aldous Hicks to pull not just the Pruitt conveyance records, but the entire chain of title for the canyon section, going back to the original federal survey of 1872. She spent 3 hours with the ledgers spread across the office counter, tracing each transfer and each tax record and each notation in the margin, building in her mind the history of that parcel of ground, the same way she built a survey, point by point, checking each new fact against the one she had already established. The Pruitts had filed their homestead claim in good faith in 1879. They had built a cabin on the section and worked it for 3 years. The abandonment, in 1883, had come at the end of the second hard winter, when the father of the family had decided the high country was too costly to hold, and they had moved down to Pueblo, where the father found work in the smelter. The homestead claim had lapsed. The land had reverted to the federal domain, but the cellar on the limestone shelf had been built before the Pruitts arrived, the mortar and log construction suggesting an earlier hand, possibly a prospecting cache from the late 1862, which meant the Pruitt family had not built it and might not have known it was there. Chester Daw had known. The map's notation of the word cellar added in a second-hand and a less practiced script, suggested he had not drawn the map himself, but had received it from someone and had added the notation himself, marking what he had found or been told about. She could not reconstruct the full chain. She did not need to. She needed enough to understand what she had, which was the location of stolen railroad funds, stored in a structure of uncertain origin on land that had once been homesteaded and was now federal, held by a map that had been made by someone who is no longer alive and sold at auction for $1 because no one had bothered to look inside the oilskin. The railroad's wire arrived on the morning of the 6th day, and she read it at the telegraph counter and paid the operator and folded it into her satchel and went back to the livery to prepare for the ride back to Garnet Springs. She thought, riding down out of the high country in the October light, that her father would have found the entire thing interesting in a specific way. Not the money, which would not have interested him much, but the map. He would have wanted to know who had trained Chester Daw, or trained whoever had made the base map that Daw had annotated. He would have asked about the paper stock and the ink color, and whether the Hatchur method suggested any particular school of survey drafting that could be traced to a region or a period. He would have spent a week on that question before he got around to thinking about what the map led to. She had spent her time differently, but she understood the impulse. The courthouse steps where she returned to meet Benton and the deputy were the same steps where the auctioneer had sold Chester Daw's effects 4 weeks earlier, and where the small crowd had watched her bid $1 on something no one else wanted. The steps were wet with a morning rain that had come through before dawn, and the cottonwood by the east corner of the building had dropped half its remaining leaves in the night, so they lay yellow and damp across the lower stairs. She arrived early and stood on the steps and thought about very little while she waited. Benton was precise in his questions, which she appreciated. He did not ask her things she had already answered, and he did not waste either of their time with expressions of surprise. He had read her wire and the auditor's file, and he had clearly done the preparatory thinking before he rode down from Denver, which was the sign of a man who worked carefully. She told him what he needed to know in the order that was most useful for him to know it, and when he asked her to repeat the compass bearings she had noted for the cellar approach, she gave them back to him from memory. "You've not touched what's inside," he said. "No," she said. "Why not?" "It was not mine," she said. He wrote something in his ledger book and then put the pen down and looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not precisely name. Not admiration, which would have been excessive, not suspicion, which would have been insulting. Something more like recognition, the kind that one careful person extends to another when the evidence of care is plain. "The Pruitt heirs," she said. "I wrote it in the wire, but I want to be certain it's in your record. The land was theirs, not legally anymore, because the claim lapsed, but the seller sat on it while they lived there, and whatever moral weight that carries ought to be considered. I've noted it," he said. "I know you've noted it," she said. "I want to know whether it will be acted on." He looked at her again with that same expression. "I'll carry the recommendation to the board," he said. She considered whether that was enough. She decided it was as much as she would get from him in good faith, and that it was therefore enough. The recovery of the funds was accomplished without her. Benton and the deputy rode up into the canyon country with a pack horse and a locksmith from the county seat, and they returned 4 days later, with the canvas bags and the leather satchels and the iron strongbox, which turned out to hold nothing but a sheaf of old transfer receipts that matched the railroad's own records almost exactly, suggesting Chester Daw had been working from inside information that the company later confirmed when they identified the source. She was not there when they brought it down. She had left Garnet Springs the morning after her meeting with Benton, headed south on the road that would eventually connect to the stage route into New Mexico, and then into Arizona territory. She had a contract to finish the River Canyon survey her father had not lived to complete, and the season for that kind of work in the lower desert country was arriving. She stopped the first night at a settlement called Ridgetop, 12 miles south of Garnet Springs, and ate at the roadhouse there, and slept in the loft of the livery, which was cleaner than it had any right to be, and was warmer than the night air outside, which had turned cold enough to freeze the water in the horse trough by morning. She lay in the dark, listening to the horses shift in their stalls below, and thought about the map, which she had given to Benton with her copies and her calculations. The original she had given him because it was evidence. The copies she had given him because they would help the recovery. She had kept nothing from the canyon, except the memory of the cellar door swinging open in the cold air and the smell of pine resin and old canvas, and the specific quality of the silence in there. Sealed air released after 4 years. The way a place can hold time inside it, the way oilskin holds a map. Her father had told her once that the best surveys were the ones that started from what you could see and worked carefully outward from there, correcting as you went, never mistaking the edge of the known for the edge of what existed. He had said it about cartography. She had found it applied more broadly. She slept well and was riding before the sun was fully up. The work in Arizona territory kept her through the winter and into the following spring. The river canyon she was surveying was a long system, deeper in its lower reaches than any map had adequately rendered, and the tributaries on the north side had been drawn by the original federal survey in ways that her father had flagged in his notes as approximate, meaning the man who had run that survey had not actually walked the tributary drainages, but had estimated them from the ridge above. Estimated surveys were common in that period and in that country. They were also frequently wrong in ways that mattered. She walked every tributary. She ran the chain down each one in sections, setting the rod at each turning point, sighting back along the tape, noting the gradients in her field book in the same careful hand her father had taught her. The work was slow, and the country was rough, and there were days when she moved the survey forward by no more than a quarter mile because the canyon walls required a detour that tripled the walking distance, and the measurements had to be recomputed twice to account for the slope. She did not find the work tedious. She had never found precision tedious. What other people called the slow part of a thing she had always recognized as the real part. The place where the difference between a careful worker and a careless one became material, where the small errors you chose not to correct accumulated into the large errors that undid everything you had built on top of them. The Arizona survey was finished by April. She delivered the finished plates to the Territorial Land Office in Prescott, rolled in a protective tube she had made herself from the same kind of heavy paper her father had used for the purpose. The land office agent looked at the plates, and then looked at her, and asked whether she had been in the field for the full survey. She said she had. He said he had expected the survey to take 2 men the better part of a year. She said she had taken 6 months alone, which she allowed was a slower pace than 2 experienced men would have managed, but a faster pace than a single experienced man working alone would typically achieve, and that the measurements were close to within 2 chains on the main traverse, which was within the contract specification. He looked at the closing calculation. He said the closing error was closer to 1 chain than 2. She said she knew. He wrote her a draft for the full survey fee and offered no further commentary, which she took as the professional acknowledgment it was. She had accumulated, over the months of the Arizona work, a small collection of things she had encountered in the canyon country that were worth noting and that did not fit neatly into a survey record. A piece of carved sandstone she had found lodged in a tributary wall, its carving worn nearly to invisibility by water but still legible in the right light as a set of marks she could not identify. Fragment of Spanish colonial ironwork, A hinge pin from something much earlier than the American survey era, found where an old trail crossed the river at a limestone ledge. A handful of seeds from a plant she had not seen before at that elevation, which she wrapped in a piece of oilskin from the swatch she carried for exactly such collections. That piece of oilskin was from Chester Dawes wrapping. She had not used the whole of it to re-wrap the compass. The oilskin had been a large square, larger than needed for the compass, and she had cut it into sections, the compass wrapped in one, the rest kept for field use. It was good oilskin, as she had noted the night she first unwrapped it, and she had found no reason to discard the remainder. There was something she appreciated about that circularity, though she would not have called it anything so imprecise as meaning. It was simply that a piece of material that had protected a map had gone on to protect other things worth keeping, which was what good materials did when they were cared for and not wasted. Her father had felt similarly about well-made tools. He had kept an inherited transit in working order across 30 years of field use because it was precisely made and because precision-made instruments deserved the maintenance that preserved them. She kept what worked. She discarded what did not. She corrected what was wrong. The Pruitt family, she learned later, from a letter forwarded through the land office in Garnet Springs, and eventually reaching her in New Mexico, where she was running a boundary survey for a cattle ranch, had received a settlement of $900 from the Colorado and Southern Railroad, described in the company's correspondence as a goodwill payment in recognition of the use of their former land. $900 out of $11,000 was not a large proportion. It was a larger proportion than they had possessed before, which had been none. The eldest Pruitt daughter, a woman named Celia, who had been 12 years old when the family left the Canyon homestead, wrote a separate letter to the railroad's Denver office that was quoted in a small item in the Pueblo newspaper. She said she had no particular feeling about the money, but that she had wondered all her life what had been in that cellar on the limestone shelf, and she was glad now to know. She read that letter in a copy of the newspaper that came her way in New Mexico, and she sat with it for a few minutes after she had finished it. She thought that Celia Pruitt had stated the thing correctly. The wondering was the part that had a weight to it. The knowing settled the weight, not by making it lighter, but by making it possible to carry. That was, more or less, what surveys were for. The boundary work in New Mexico took her through 2 counties and into the spring of 1889. She was 28 years old when she finished it, and she had, by that point, run enough survey work in her own name that her father's contracts were no longer the primary frame for what she did. She had contracts of her own, smaller ones at first, and then as the quality of her work became known among the land offices and the attorneys who managed estate boundaries and the railroad companies that needed precise route approaches, larger one. She worked alone when she could, and with a hired assistant when the job required. She kept her father's compass always, the oilskin around it replaced now with a fresh piece she had purchased in Santa Fe, though she kept the swatch of Chester Dawes' original oilskin at the bottom of her satchel, for no reason she could have explained to anyone who asked. No one asked. The contents of a working cartographer's satchel did not typically invite inquiry, which suited her. She charted country that was being settled, and country that was being contested, and country that had been argued over for 40 years without resolution. And she brought to all of it the same habit her father had instilled in her, the habit of going where the lines actually were, rather than where they had been assumed to be, and of writing down what was actually there, rather than what was easier to record. Maps made in that spirit were the kind that held up. Maps made otherwise were the kind that generated the disputes she was later hired to resolve. In the summer of 1891, she returned to Colorado for a boundary survey that took her through the hill country south of Garnet Springs and on a Sunday in late July she rode north into town along the same road she had left it on 4 years earlier. The courthouse still stood on the main street. The cottonwood by the east corner was larger. The auction steps looked the same. She did not stop. She had no particular reason to, and the boundary work waited, and the summer light was still strong enough in the afternoon to get another 2 hours of field measurement before she needed to make camp. She rode through Garnet Springs and out the north side and up into the hill country, her father's compass in the oilskin-wrapped case. At the top of her satchel, the chain tape coiled at her hip, the field book open across the saddle horn to the page where she had left off. The ridge ahead of her read clearly in the afternoon light, its contours legible, its drainages evident, its geometry already beginning to resolve into the lines she would draw that evening by lamplight in the field book, adding one more careful section to the record of ground that had been walked and measured and found to be exactly what it was. She rode toward it and did not look back.